Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 60th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Anju Grossman. My friends know me as JAG. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the literature and ideas of Ayn Rand in creative ways, like our graphic novels and animated videos. Today, we are joined by one of my favorite authors, Sebastian Junger. And before I even get into introducing our guest, I want to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can use the comment sections to type in your questions. Please make them short and take advantage of this wonderful opportunity to chat with Sebastian. Sebastian Junger is the New York Times best-selling author of 5 books: Tribe, War, A Death in Belmont, Fire, and, of course, The Perfect Storm. He is the co-director of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Restrepo, which took home the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance. His latest book, Freedom, explores the tension between the two human drives for independence and community. And it is a really fascinating read, juxtaposed against a journey that he took with 3 friends, including 2 Afghan war vets, along the railroad lines of the East Coast of the United States. Sebastian, welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So this is an aptly timed interview for your book, Freedom. We just celebrated Independence Day this past weekend. How did you spend your Independence Day this year?
Well, I have 2 young children, 2 little girls, age 4 and age 1.5. And the family sleeps together, and we usually head off to bed whenever the girls get sleepy, around 9 or 10 p.m. And by the time the fireworks were going off, I think I was sound asleep. We all were sound asleep. I've been in enough combat that fireworks will wake me up. It's not my favorite time of year, and it didn't even wake me up. So I was pretty tired.
So that's interesting, and I read a bit about your new family, and you have some strong views which you are practicing in terms of how you're raising your children. A lot of them are based on your understanding of history and of sort of evolutionary biology. So my question is, when you and your children as a family, you sleep together, do they end up going to bed later, or do you end up going to bed earlier?
I sort of a little bit of both, I think. I mean, the little one falls asleep. She nurses, and she falls asleep nursing, usually around 9 o'clock, right? And the older one lasts about another hour or so. We read stories and things like that. And so my wife and the little one will go up to bed. It's not a bed. We sleep on the floor, on a pad on the floor that takes up sort of most of the room. So they go off to bed, and then by the time my little one and I join them, they're asleep, and we fall asleep. And so it really is dictated by when everyone gets sleepy. But I would say that I get more sleep than I used to, because I do go to bed earlier. When I was, quote, young and single in New York, I would go to bed at all hours and then wake up early. And so, that's very hard on your health. So I would say this has actually been a very restful time for us.
Well, that's very interesting, because a lot of relatively new parents would say that having children is not conducive to getting more sleep. So happy to hear that's not the case with you. Now, Independence Day commemorates the passage of the Declaration of Independence, a rejection of despotic government, followed by the Constitution, which is strictly focused on limiting the power of government. In that context, freedom is a measure of individual and community autonomy from government control. Is that how you understand freedom in this book?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to limit it to the United States and to the, frankly, wonderful revolution that we had in 1776 that threw off a tyrannical power, King George III. And, he was the end of a long line of European despots who had ruled Europe through the Middle Ages with an iron hand and were bound by no laws, by no morality other than the ones they elected to follow. And everyone else was effectively serfs. And so what we Americans threw off was that terrible legacy. And what we claimed as a right was that the people have the right to govern themselves through representatives that they elect, and that those representatives, some of whom were very powerful people, very rich and very powerful, and the generals and everyone else of real consequence and importance in society, that all of those people were bound by the same laws and had to pay the same taxes as everybody else. And so that was revolutionary, to put powerful people under the jurisdiction of the same laws and authorities that the commoners were under. That was a very revolutionary principle. And the framers, of course, were themselves drawn from an elite segment of society, and they placed themselves under those same constraints, right? And they really understood that they were there to serve the people and not the other way around. So what I would say is that every human society has to find this balance between being sufficiently well organized and hierarchical to maintain public order and a public defense, but not so much so that an abusive or cruel arbitrary ruler can use the apparatus of state to suppress the individual and to enrich him or herself at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, I've been enjoying some of the quotes which you've created, or someone on your team has created into memes on your social media accounts. And one of them, I think, was along the lines that any society which is organized enough to protect itself can also be organized enough to oppress the people that are within that community. So it is a tension. But again, as I mentioned, you combined it with this journey, this 400-mile journey that you and a few friends took on foot, following the train tracks, of course. Us at the Atlas Society, inspired by Atlas Shrugged, we have a special fondness for the railroad and railroad metaphors. What inspired you? I know, reading some of your previous interviews, you had gone on a hitchhiking trip in your early 20s, but this was a very different kind of trip.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the guys I did this with were, we'd all been in a lot of combat. And, I think we were all having some effects from that, not grave ones, but some effects. And one of those effects is to feel somewhat alienated from the society you're coming home to. You may not get that problem if you're fighting within your home territory against an invader. That probably feels very different. But for all of us, we were in other places and coming back to a society that struck us as somewhat odd when we came back. And so what I wanted to do was encounter this country that I love dearly. My father immigrated here. He was a refugee from 2 wars in Europe. He fled fascism in 1936 in Spain, and then when the Nazis came into France, and he just adored this country for what it offered to humanity and to him. And I feel the same way. And I wanted to get to know my country again in the most sort of unfiltered way possible. And for some reason, staring out the window of a train going down to DC one day from New York, I realized, wow, there's a way to walk along the railroad lines the whole way. Like, there's dirt bike trails and maintenance roads and woods and cornfields and sometimes through ghettos and rich suburbs, whatever, but you can thread your way through. And I understood the rail lines to be a kind of no man's land. There's no police surveillance out there. I mean, if they know that you're out there, the police will come try to find you, which happened to us a couple of times. But basically, it's no man's land. It's unmonitored. There's other marginal people out there, and it's sort of wide open for whatever your needs are. So if it's raining, you can camp under a bridge, under an overpass, and there's creeks to get your water out of, and there's firewood to make, to cook, you make fires to cook on, and you go through every conceivable American environment. And I thought, that's what I want to do. And so we walked in several sections. We didn't do it all at once. Over the course of a year, from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. And then instead of continuing to New York as we planned, we sort of wheeled westwards and headed for Pittsburgh and crossed the length of Pennsylvania, mostly along the Juniata River, which we can talk about in a bit if you'd like. And as I say in the book, over the course of 400 miles, most nights we were the only people who knew where we were. And that there's many definitions of freedom. They're all interesting and worth talking about, but surely that's one of them. And it was a form of freedom that I found extremely gratifying to experience, although it was very hard. We called it high-speed vagrancy. We were carrying 60, 70 pounds on our backs. And, physically speaking, it was a very arduous trip.
So one of the evenings on your journey, you were cooking dinner when a freight train you described thundering by with so much noise and power. You asked what would it take to stop something like that instantaneously. And you thought, well, maybe a wall. And then you thought, no, it would have to be another train traveling in the same, at the same speed, but in the opposite direction. And you thought America could be seen like that as well, a country moving so fast and with so much weight that only a head-on collision with itself could make it stop. So unpack that metaphor for us, if you will.
I mean, we're the most powerful country in the world by orders of magnitude and probably ever in history. And it's hard for me to imagine. I mean, maybe it could happen, but it's hard for me to imagine a foreign power other than, I don't know, an alien invasion or something. But it's hard for me to imagine the Russians or the Chinese or whoever you want to imagine coming into this country and defeating us and taking over this land. Just militarily speaking, I don't think it's conceivable. I don't think they get past our Navy, for starters. I don't even think they'd get to our shores. So the threat, I mean, we can be harmed by other groups such as Al-Qaeda, obviously harmed us grievously on 9/11 20 years ago. But I don't think that's an existential threat. But what to me is an existential threat is the possibility of a political and even a violent split within this country that actually sort of destroys the democratic norms that we all count on for peaceful transitions of power, and for a society that at least is striving to be equitable and egalitarian and just.
Well, interesting. When we talk about freedom and what those definitions are, and then of course, equitable and egalitarian, whether that is we're all equal before the law, or that we're seeking equal outcomes. And I think that there are many people that came to our country from other countries that were promising an egalitarian ideal, were promising community, collectivism, and your wife grew up in communist Bulgaria, and reading about her experience living crowded in a one-bedroom apartment with no hot water, no central heating. It reminded me a lot of another woman who came from totalitarianism. Of course, that's Ayn Rand. And the root of the word communism and community, that they derive from a similar kind of etymological meaning. But I think that some of the people that have fled communism have a certain cynicism, skepticism about a government that promises a community and a shared distribution of resources. So what lessons about freedom can we draw from experiences of such countries that were trying to achieve these egalitarian ends by totalitarian control, or maybe even not necessarily originally totalitarian control, but that if you are trying to enforce or ensure equal outcomes, force becomes inevitable.
Yeah, and that was my first wife, my former wife, Daniela. who I'm still very good friends with. I'm remarried. Yes, she grew up, the first half of her life was under communism, and then the second half until she came to America was after the wall fell in Russia. I mean, a lot of points, and I'm trying to recall them, but basically every government does share resources with everybody to some degree. Every time you build a federal highway, you're sharing, you're taking taxes and building a resource that all can use. I mean, every government does that. If you're on a life raft, if your boat sinks and you're on a life raft and you have 10 gallons of water, there is a common agreement among the people on the life raft about how fast to drink the water, right? And you may want more than 5 sips a day, but if the group decides that it's risky to drink the whole thing now, you're out of luck, right? And so that's, that writ small is sort of how government works. It figures out what the resources are and how to distribute them. What I would say about communism, I mean, first of all, communism and totalitarianism are not the same thing. You can be a totalitarian state and not be communist. I think the word community refers to an ancient and organic human norm where people are able to survive and even thrive because they live in the context of a group. I mean, humans die immediately in nature if they're alone. They die within days usually. But in groups, we have been able to survive and thrive and actually dominate the planet. We're social primates, and we are not designed to survive by ourselves. And in fact, there's an amazing example and a tragic one of the last, what can we call him? The last free person, entirely free, independent, autonomous person in this country was a man named Ishi. He was from the Yahi tribe in California. He was the last of the Yahi. And he lived for years. All of his people died out. And he lived into the 1900s independently in the canyons south of Mount Lassen in California. And he had, Stone Age survival skills. That was his environment. And alone, he could not do it. He finally wandered down into a nearby town and gave himself up because he could not survive by himself. So community refers to the people immediately around you that help provide your survival needs and hopefully ease the emotional and physical burdens of life. Communism is really describes a system of government where the major industries have been collectivized, are owned by the state. The state pays a sort of small stipend to everybody so that nobody starves and nobody gets rich. There's easy access to sort of mediocre healthcare. You will always have housing. I mean, we could argue whether that's a good or a bad paradigm. Obviously, the wall fell in 1989. Capitalism took over for some both good and bad effects. But the small communities of the sort that my former wife grew up in these housing complexes, very similar to the communities in the developments in Manhattan that I live near in the Lower East Side. Those little communities continue to function exactly like they did before the wall fell, right? They were just small groupings of people that relied on each other for their basic needs. And that didn't change. And that's an eternal human need that I think is totally independent of the kind of government we have.
Yes, well, we're probably not going to agree on communism because my view is that, if you're going to want to have equal outcomes, that you're actually also going to not be able to generate. I mean, first, resources have to be created in order to be shared, and that requires capital, and that requires freedom and competition. But certainly, there is no debating with the need for community, and I think that, as you demonstrate in your book and as you demonstrated in Tribe, part of what the difficult transition that a lot of the soldiers that you were embedded with over in Afghanistan, it was not so much the trauma that they experienced in war and then coming back to peacetime, but actually it was not necessarily leaving something bad, coming back to something good. It was the experience of having a community, of having this band of brothers, and then coming back and having that shift to a sort of a single person's lifestyle, or even within a family. And you also talk about a similar kind of experience that even people that had been in the Peace Corps
Yeah.
that did not have as much of a traumatic experience came back to, and that's something I related to because my parents were in the Peace Corps, and that's where I was born in India.
Wow.
So in your film, which I had the opportunity to watch, Restrepo was nominated for an Academy Award, and your book War is both a riveting account of your experience alongside a single platoon throughout a 15-month tour of duty in the most dangerous outpost in Afghanistan's Korangal Valley. But it's also a exploration of the psychology of combat and wartime. And one of the sidebars that I thought was interesting was from your perspective as a journalist, trying to maintain journalistic integrity, following the rules, even as, you were, for all intents and purposes, living, with these men as part of their community. And you talked about how journalists endeavoring to cover an assignment could find themselves relying on a paradigm of that they had inherited from the Vietnam War, and kind of a default mode of cynicism and an assumption of despair on the part of the troops, which was not borne out, by the experience of the men themselves. Is that? Could you
Yeah.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, of course. No, it's a great topic. And let me just say, I think our views on communism are probably just about identical. I think it's an awful, oppressive system, and I don't think that they are looking for similar outcomes. I think it's more complex than that. But I think we're in total agreement. It's a horrible system, a horrible thing to do to a society. But yeah, for Restrepo, so there were two things going on. And of course, as in any sort of bad marriage or whatever, they were feeding each other. So you had a default cynicism by the press corps, because the last major war that the US was in Vietnam. And frankly, there was a lot of dishonesty at times by the government. And, the war started with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which itself was not an entirely honest communication by the government. And, there were some sound reasons for fighting that war, but they weren't necessarily communicated to the public, I think. So there was some cynicism by the press that carried forward to the next, generation of like daring war journalists who like traipsed off to Afghanistan to cover the next, I'm putting this in quotes, right, the next US debacle, right? And their default assumption was that generals are stupid and they lie to you, and that every war is wrong, and et cetera, right? And but the military played their part as well, right? They didn't trust the press as far as they could throw them, so they were often really not very honest with them either. And I remember talking to a press officer. We were there for so long, and we were so well liked and so well known, so familiar to these guys, that they started. I think they forgot that we were civilians, or that we were journalists, or whatever. Like, we were sort of in the brotherhood, right? And so one guy, a press officer, said, "Hey, Sebastian, can you just give me some advice about how to talk to the press, because they don't believe anything I say." And I laughed, and I said, "Well, they don't believe anything you say because you only give them good news, right? But surely bad things happen in a war. I mean, by definition, they do, right? So if the American casualty count's going up, don't say it's because the insurgency's losing and getting desperate. Like, that's just nonsensical. Like, give them an honest answer. And if you say something that makes if you say something that isn't good, they will trust you when you say something that is good, that you did build that school and it did educate some children, et cetera, et cetera. But if you only give them the good news, they're human beings. They know how to sniff out nonsense, right? So you got to treat them like adults and give them both, because both is the reality. I don't know if he followed my advice on that or not, But you can see the sort of cycle that the two got into with the press corps and the press officers chasing each other around, each determined to instill their completely like binary story in the other person's thinking.
Now, was your experience, do you think that the extent of the access that you had, the amount of time that you spent, was that, it doesn't seem standard, but maybe it was?
You know, we sort of slipped through the gap, right? I mean, no one, I think the military, I think it didn't, the military is used to dealing with press photographers, TV, press journalists, and I mean, TV and newspaper journalists who, you know, basically these organizations have enough money to send someone on one trip for 2 weeks and that's it. And they get a, you know, a sort of sampling of what's going on. They come home and they write their story. And inevitably it's a story about, it's a big picture story. I mean, maybe they focus on the outpost, but there's always the paragraph, the 3 paragraphs framing it in how is the war going? What are the mistakes that were made? What are, you know, whatever. It's standard front page journalism. What they weren't prepared for was 2 journalists who were not filing daily deadlines, were not filing at all, in fact, over the course of a year, hardly at all, and had the money to do, you know, trip after trip to the same little outpost that was in the middle of nowhere and had almost no bearing on the overall war. And, you know, at the very end, my colleague Tim, who I made this Restrepo with, we both, you know, carried video cameras, shot all the video. We were there sometimes together, sometimes apart. Tim had gone there in, you know, May. Most of our trips were like a month. And like 2 months later, the colonel showed up and passed through the area and saw Tim and realized he'd been there the entire time and was pretty upset. And so I think the military just, it never occurred to them 2 journalists would do this. What I will say is that we weren't covering the war. We were trying to understand the subjective experience of a group of about 30 guys. And so we were not making any commentary about good, bad decisions. Is it moral, immoral, nothing like that. We were really completely embedded subjectively with this platoon, and our work product came out way later.
Mm-hmm. Is Tim the friend and colleague that was killed?
Yeah, Tim was killed just 10 years ago. A few weeks after we went to the Oscars, we didn't win an Oscar, but we were nominated for an Oscar for Restrepo. And we were very proud to be on the red carpet. And we took a couple of soldiers and their wives, you know, from the platoon. And it was pretty amazing. Very proud moment for us. And we were supposed to head off on assignment to Libya to cover the civil war in Libya that was raging. It was the Arab Spring, and the Arab world was inflamed. We're journalists. You know, we do many more things than just cover the US military, right? We've covered all kinds of things for years. The Arab world's in flames. We want to go cover it. The last minute I couldn't go. And Tim went on his own and was killed in the city of Misrata by a mortar fired by Gaddafi's forces. He was on the front line and he just caught a little piece of metal in his groin, but it hit his artery, his femoral artery, and he bled out in the back of a rebel pickup truck racing for the Misrata hospital with some other wounded Libyan fighters.
Very, very rough. I'm remembering the article now about about your experience at the Oscars and things that you were going through in your life at the time. And now I'm starting to get the timeline correct. Yeah. So thanks for that correction. So, you know, spending over a year, 15 months with these men, filming them, sleeping with them, eating with them, going out on patrols, going out on missions with them, asking for advice, giving advice. You know, you got to know them pretty well. And I mean, to the extent that even years later, they came along with you on the journey that ended up being part of this book. So thinking about the paradigms, another paradigm that we are, you know, obsessed with right now is this idea of systematic institutional racism and And that is a theme that you do explore, I think, beautifully and tragically in A Death in Belmont. But with regard to your experience with these soldiers in Afghanistan, with the troops in Afghanistan, was your experience that, how critical was skin color in the way that soldiers, white soldiers, black soldiers, thought about themselves, thought about each other, thought about their country one way or another? Was that one of your big takeaways from your time?
I didn't actually interview them about what they thought about their country. They weren't thinking about their country a whole lot. I mean, they missed their girlfriends and their families and what have you. But they were really focused on what they were doing there, and
Mm-hmm.
their orientation was do the mission safely, get everyone home alive, do our work, and go home and leave the Korengal Valley in a little better condition for the next unit than they received it in. And that was, in other words, they were complete professionals, and they did. So I didn't have conversations about America per se. What I will say is that I myself didn't see examples of racism. Maybe I wouldn't recognize it if I saw it, but I didn't see any. But the combat units were almost completely white and Latino. I mean, there was in a second platoon battle company of the 173rd Airborne that I was with, there was one black guy, and he, I asked him eventually. It took me a while to get to know him, and he was sort of interesting personality and a little intimidating, frankly, and wonderful guy, really amazing and incredible soldier. And I asked him, I finally sort of worked up the nerve to ask something personal of him. I said, what do you make of this? You're the only black guy in the platoon. What's with that? Right. And he said, he said, look, black folks really aren't that eager to get shot at. It happens enough in their neighborhoods. Like, we're not going to sign up for it. He said, I'm a weirdo, but he was laughing as he said it, but that was his answer about the fact that the combat platoons were almost completely non-African American. They were white and Latino primarily. But he also said this other thing. He said, that everybody here, he said that he hadn't really experienced any racism. He said once in a while there's a little whiff of something that is a little ugly. And he said it's very, very rare, once in a while. And he said, but you know what? Even those guys, those few guys that he believes were maybe a little racist in their thinking, he said, you know what? I'm a good soldier, and not one of them wouldn't take me in a firefight. They would all have me by their side in a firefight. And so that reality of combat, where you may need to give blood to help save a wounded brother's life. You may need to run through gunfire to drag a wounded brother to safety, or they would do that for you. Like in that sort of circumstance, not only does race disappear, but so do politics, right? There were Democrats out there and Republicans and everything in between. There was religious people and a lot of non-religious people. There was everything, right? And no one really paid any heed to any of it at a place like that.
Well, that's interesting. You saying that politics wasn't playing a big role, race wasn't playing a big role. People were focused on what they had to do. Religion wasn't playing a big role. Earlier this year, some lawmakers, like Representative Steve Cohen of Tennessee, voiced concerns about the ideological makeup of National Guardsmen, posing a potential national security threat. There's been calls for the U.S. military to more closely vet soldiers for extremist views. From your perspective, is that a concern? I mean, do you think that these are all potential white supremacist insurrectionists, or it doesn't sound like it's matching up with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I have a sample size of 30 here, and there's 2 million people. And
there's a sample size of 30, yet you probably, from your relationships, their relationships, I mean, it wasn't cut off from the larger military experience.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say to that is, no, I mean, the men that I knew, was all men out there, and the men that I knew were not voicing opinions like that. But it was 2007. this is almost 15 years ago, that there's been a lot of social and political changes in this country since then. And my understanding from conversations is that on the larger bases like Bagram, there were actually sort of, quote, big city problems, right? There was sexual harassment, there was rape, there was racism, that those problems disappeared in the extreme danger and isolation of the small outposts. But once you got to the larger bases where most US military is, right? I mean, most of the US military is not at tiny outposts. It's a sort of, we see the dramatic stuff, that's the tip of the iceberg, but most of the iceberg is underwater at larger bases. And so there may well have been societal problems in those bases I just didn't experience because I was never at them. I mean, what I will say is that on Facebook, basically, I some years ago when I enrolled with Facebook, like I didn't really understand how it worked. And basically anyone who wanted to be my friend, I'd say yes, right? So I got a really weird, diverse sampling. I'm a Democrat, so I got a whole bunch of lefties that say annoying things. I got a whole bunch of conservatives that are also saying annoying things, a bunch of soldiers, a bunch of everything, right? And, I do have to say in recent years, some of the online rhetoric, which maybe doesn't represent honest views. I think there's a sort of escalation of rhetoric that happens in social media that I don't entirely take at face value. But, there's some, I've seen some vets, say some pretty disturbing things about, the coming civil war in this country and, whatever, just stuff that to me is not very democratically minded. And, if it's obnoxious enough, I just unfriend them because I don't want to read it. I think it's insulting to the sacrifices that many have made for this democracy. But, basically, I think the concern, I think there was a study done, right, of political opinion within the military, and I think I'm guessing the military monitors social media, and they're probably seeing some of the same comments that I've seen, and I think their concern probably came from that. I'm not cynical enough to think that they would mount an inquiry like that with zero basis. I just don't know why they would do that. But I don't know. I'm not an expert. I mean, I would ask the congressman.
Yeah, fair enough. We are going to get to some of the questions. I'm going to take a look at those, but I also wanted to return to the topic we had touched upon earlier, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And you've written about the challenges of soldiers find in transitioning from combat to civilian life. And you made I thought, a very interesting point. You said that ex-combatants should not be encouraged to see themselves as victims. And from your perspective, how has our understanding of PTSD changed? And do you see a danger or risk of treating it as a chronic pathology, which categorizes people as permanent victims?
Right. I mean, I think any psychologist would say no one should cling to the victim identity because it precludes recovery, right? And if you become dependent on it, either because you're getting a government stipend or whatever, or your identity depends on that victimhood as a source of sort of social empowerment. Anyone who clings to that identity is doing themselves a disservice. So I would include veterans in that group. One of the predictors of long-term PTSD, I mean, there is a biological and psychological reaction to trauma. You have a car accident, certain things are going to happen to you psychologically and physically in the ensuing days and weeks that is your body adapting to the trauma and recovering from it, right? That's a trauma reaction. It's transitory. And in most people, within a month or so, it starts to sort of ease off. There are people, and statistically, they are associated with childhood trauma. There are people who are traumatized as adults, including veterans. Childhood trauma, meaning violence and sexual trauma, of course, that makes them particularly vulnerable, not to PTSD, but to long-term chronic PTSD, which can last a lifetime. Something like 20% of people who have been traumatized just keep cycling back into this trauma loop and can't get out of it. And that's where you have a chronic condition. I think the word victim is, I don't think it has a place in the therapeutic conversation. But in terms of long-term trauma reaction, there is a real danger in classifying oneself as permanently disabled by PTSD. There's some financial incentives to do that because the military will continue giving you disability payments. There's social incentives to do it. People take pity on you. They have empathy because you were brave, you fought for the country, and you paid a price. There's a lot of sort of incentives to continue that sort of wounded warrior sort of identity. But in the end of the day, it keeps you from reintegrating in a healthy way back into society, which supposedly is the point of all this. So, I would say that's a real danger in a medical establishment that tends to pathologize and then medicate problems.
Culturally, do you think there's something larger going on here? Not just having to do with veterans, but how we view victimhood. I remember my grandmother, when something would happen to you, you'd fall down or whatever, you complain, she'd just say, well, just get on up and go about your business and stop crying and stop complaining. And it seems, just that, though compassionate, that we might be going overboard, and then also within a context of trying to be compassionate about people who have had a bad experience or had something bad happen to them, that there's almost a moral exaltation to victimhood, which can then make it something that, like, oh, I'm oppressed. Somebody spoke to me in the wrong way. So,
well, I mean, I think our society has incentivized victimhood by giving people the misunderstanding that victims get extra rights, right? And I think that's not only bad for society, I think it's bad for the individuals, and it incentivizes people to see themselves as victims, and they sort of claim these extra rights, and other people, they can sort of silence other people by saying, I'm the biggest victim in the room, so you be quiet now, you listen to my truth, or whatever, right? I hate that kind of thinking. And, there's victimhood all over the place. There's some, extreme left-wing people who think they're victims. There are extreme right-wing people who think they're victims. There were some of the people that invaded the U.S. Capitol on January 6th think they were victims, right? I mean, on and on. It goes on and on, right? And so there's victims everywhere. And I think what we need, I think we have a lack of compassion in our society. It's a mass industrialized, highly technological society, very atomized, very alienated. I think there's a sort of lack of compassion. But then on the other hand, there's a sort of over-victimization of people. And I think they're both very bad. I'll end this answer with a quick anecdote of someone who I think could serve as an example to us all, on whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, or vet or non-vet or anything. So I gave a talk down at Norfolk Naval Base, and I was leaving the next morning. I was in a hotel off post early in the morning, and I came out from the hotel waiting for my car to the airport, and there was this old guy in a wheelchair missing half his right leg, bandaged, right? It had just been taken off him, right? And he was trying to get into a locked car, and I walked up and I was like, hey, can I help you, sir? And he said, oh, that's okay. I'll just wait for my wife who has the keys. And I said, wow, I looked down his leg. I said, that seems really painful. And he says, oh, it's okay. He had no self-pity at all. He's like, it's okay. It's interesting. It's a new situation. It's interesting. He wouldn't even say it was painful, right? So I was like, oh, you're a tough nut. I'll try again. I said, wow, you seem really brave about it. And he looked at me like I was the biggest fool he'd seen all week. And he said, brave about it? There's young people in this country missing both their legs. Don't tell me that I'm brave, right? And, he wasn't making any distinction about any of those people, right? Democrats, Republicans, black, white, old, whatever. He was just saying, there are other Americans who are suffering more than me. Don't worry about me, sir, right? And, I think we all need a dose of that, all across the political spectrum and the social spectrum.
Well, one of the themes that we focus on at the Atlas Society, so we do focus on victimhood. We've done a Draw My Life, My Name is Victimhood, to talk about how that can be so spiritually corrosive, and also how it can be politically manipulated, both to gain power, to gain extra extra goodies or extra privileges. But we also did kind of a flip side video on gratitude, and that's something which is an antidote. It's kind of kryptonite to victimhood and to resentment and to so many of the kind of for me pathologies that we can obsess about.
Yeah. Oh, gratitude is enormously important. I think the older you get, the easier it is to access, because you start counting your days. I mean, I almost died last year. I had a undiagnosed.
If you share that experience, I mean, it was when you were just mentioning your friend and having his femoral artery cut. I mean, we had a very strangely similar experience caused by nothing.
Yeah, I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in an abdominal artery, asymptomatic. It was congenital, right? It was just I was born with it, and without warning, it ruptured last year, and I lost 90% of my blood, 90, right? I mean, I was beyond dead. I mean, I was conscious, I was talking, and they managed to save me. Right? I mean, nobody survives this, right? And they managed to save me. And now every day is the life I shouldn't have, and statistically shouldn't be living every single day. And I'm aware of it, right? And that definitely changes your experience of stressors, right? Nothing's a stressor now because I'm lucky to experience anything. Even sitting in, I'm even lucky to be sitting in traffic without air conditioning. I'm sorry, it's all a form of good luck, And if we could, if we could all access that, it would make us much, just for starters, much more pleasant with each other.
I completely agree. I say it is, in order to be objective, you have to have perspective, and the starting perspective should be that we've all won the lottery by living here in America and living at this time in history as well. Where there's so much
I would broaden it. I think you could edit your sentence. I would say we are all lucky to be living anywhere, in any way, right? Unless you're in chronic, intense pain. I mean, of course, there's circumstances that, but for most people, I think we can just say we're lucky to be alive.
So the boxing, we talk about getting older, entering, our second half of life. We're both in that boat. Most people at that stage say, oh, maybe I'm going to take up stamp collecting, or maybe I'm going to take up bird watching, or maybe I'm going to sign up for an Atlas Society book club. You decided to take up boxing. What's up with that?
It's very, very scary. Boxing is very, very, I found it very, very frightening, and physically.
You like scary. You like frightening, apparently. I'm looking at your oeuvre.
I feel like I encounter important things about myself when I'm doing things that I'm not sure will turn out well. Now, I have 2 little girls. I will do nothing to jeopardize my own health or survival because I don't want to deprive myself of them or them of a father, right? So I'm no more war reporting, none of that stuff. I don't even cross the street against the light. I mean, I'm pathetic, right? But I do need something that puts me in what feels like a situation where I'm in over my head. And even friendly sparring, you can feel that way. And I just kind of need that. The walking along the railroad lines was the same way, man. That was an alien atmosphere, and it was potentially dangerous, and it was freaky out there, right? And I just needed that. And so boxing is one of the ways I get that now. And I grew up in very safe, comfortable circumstances, and I think I grew up feeling like I just needed to be tested in order to feel like I'm alive.
Or you thought you grew up in very safe circumstances, which, now that I've read A Death in Belmont, turned out safely.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. Is that once you're, without giving a spoiler to the book, it's a book about the Boston Stranglers. It's something that happened, I think, like early 60s.
Early 60s, yeah. So the self-confessed Boston Strangler, Al DeSalvo, during the time that he said he was murdering people, was working for my parents as a carpenter. And there was a murder down the street in Belmont, about a mile away in Belmont, of the exact same modus operandi as all the crimes that he confessed to. But a black guy who had cleaned this lady's house that day was tried and convicted of the crime and sentenced to life in prison. And he wouldn't even when offered parole on condition that he expressed regret for his crime, he refused his freedom because he said, I just did not commit that crime. And years later, I mean, my family knew when DeSalvo was caught for serial rape and confessed to these murders, my family had this awful secret that Al was down the street at our home alone all day and might have killed Bessie Goldberg. And so my book is an inquiry into the circumstances of all that and what likely happened.
So looking back among your books, what percentage of the people that read your books is an audience that you've retained from the beginning, from The Perfect Storm? Does it change over time?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, when I started, my book War about the platoon that I was with in Afghanistan, that got me obviously a lot of military readers that I don't necessarily think were there before. I mean, some of them maybe read The Perfect Storm or saw the movie, but that put me within the military readership. I think that continued with Tribe because part of Tribe, not all of it, but one chapter of it dealt with PTSD as an example of alienation within society. And then Freedom isn't at all explicitly about the military, but it's divided into three sections: run, fight, and think, which are the three ways that human society over the last 10,000 years, that human groups have maintained their autonomy in the face of a more powerful foe. And so I think there's a certain amount of that way of thinking that resonates with soldiers and former soldiers.
So we're going to wrap it up in a few minutes, but I mentioned up at the top that I wanted to touch on a bit of your unique parenting style, and parenting is a topic that we've focused on here on this webinar, including our interview with Lenore Skenazy, who wrote Free Range Parenting. How did you come to this style? Was this your wife had, and obviously she doesn't say in it, but tell us a little bit about it's not just the sleeping together as a family. You don't have a stroller, right? You are always holding your children.
Yeah, I mean, obviously strollers were invented after pavement was invented, and all this stuff is quite new. I mean, for the last 10,000 years, humans have lived in homes that were generally one large space with a hearth at one side of it, and people slept in groups. They slept together with their children. And certainly if you go backpacking into the Bob Marshall Wilderness area with grizzly bears and all that stuff in Montana, you're probably not going to put your 12-month-old in a separate little tent, right? The 12-month-old is going to be with you. The quote modern style of parenting really originated in England a couple hundred years ago. It's unique to the English-speaking world, it's predominantly the English-speaking world, and it started, relatively recently in human history. But for most of human history, people slept in groups, and of course they didn't have strollers. The Apache didn't have strollers; they carried their children, and by age 5 or so, the children were sort of strong enough to walk a good portion of the day, even carrying some weight and helping the tribe. So that's the human norm. And so, I've been all over the world, in Africa and Afghanistan, everywhere people sleep in groups and children walk, or young children are carried. It's very easy to carry a child. You can sling a child by a strap on your front or on your back. And, so I have in the city, we live in a 3-story walk-up, so having a stroller wouldn't be practical anyway. There's no elevator, obviously. So, I would have our littlest girl up strapped to my chest, and my 4-year-old would be on my shoulders with her legs dangling down. That's a total of about 60 pounds, right? So, I can walk all day long with 60 pounds. I walk 400 miles along the railroad lines carrying 60 pounds. If I can't do that to get them to daycare and back, what am I alive for? Jesus, that's just a baseline of human performance that we should all be able to do, or parents should be able to do. So that's our thinking about that. And as a result, there's very little sibling rivalry. You know, they're so securely attached to us because they're not separated from us at night. That scary time that I remember as a little kid when, oh, it's time to go to bed, and you get put in your room, the door gets closed, and you're in the darkness. Like, it's terrifying for a little primate, which is what little children are. They're young primates. It's terrifying. They get their safety from proximity to adults. And so a 6-month-old doesn't know that they're in Belmont, Massachusetts, and safe as can be, right? So the thinking there is that it makes for very securely attached children, which, at least in the case of our 2 little girls, certainly seems to be the case.
So you once gave a commencement speech to a graduating class at an elite New York school, and correct me if I'm failing to capture this, but it seemed like your central piece of advice was be prepared to fail. That children who are over-prepared to succeed may catastrophize failure or fail to take the risks that lead to failure, but ultimately to learning. What was your message there, and how can we all maybe learn from that?
Yeah, no, it was a great question. I mean, I feel like in sort of elite societies, and I grew up in that, so I know it very well. There's this sort of obsession with accomplishment and success, and you want an unblemished resume, no gap years where you can't explain what you were doing because you were hitchhiking across Africa or whatever. You know, you really, and it's a ghastly, inhuman way to have a child lead their life. And so I didn't say be prepared to fail. I said be determined to fail. Make sure you fail, right? I mean, if you don't fail, you clearly aren't getting anywhere close to your capacities, right? You're clearly only doing things that you have completely mastered. And really, what's the point if that's all you're doing with your life? So, and if you fail periodically, you're testing yourself, and people adapt to failure. They learn a lot. You learn a lot more from failure and from pain than you do from success and pleasure. And you need full quantities of both to be a fully informed, fully integrated human being. And so that's what I was telling them. Like, don't worry about your parents and your resume. Just make sure you go out there and fail a couple of times, and you'll be a fuller, probably happier person for it.
So in that regard, what are some of your best failures, or because all of your books have been successful and
all right. So I was a pretty good distance runner when I was young. I was determined to go to the Olympics. I worked as hard as I could, and this is gets back to similar outcomes. It's not possible to have similar outcomes for everybody. The genetics, if nothing else, genetics determines a lot of outcomes. So nobody trained harder than me at 17, right? I ran a 4:12 mile in college, which is pretty decent,
wow.
right?
Yeah.
But I didn't go to the Olympics, right? I ran just as hard as any Olympic runner, but they had better genetics. Now, in my terms, that was a failure. I failed to be the world-class runner that I fantasized being. Then a little bit later in life, I divorced the woman that you mentioned from Bulgaria. I'm still good friends with her, but we got divorced, and it was a tough time in both of our lives. And I wanted to put my head in a different place. I started boxing. I don't think I'm a very good boxer, but I also started playing accordion. And I knew nothing about music. And talk about failure. I mean, I couldn't find C on a keyboard, right? I mean, failure after failure, wretched song after wretched song. I learned to play, and I'm a pretty good player now. I mean, people will listen to me and enjoy it. And so that's what I mean about failure. Like, don't be scared of it. That's the only way to something of real value, I think.
I could not agree more. So finally, to close, Sebastian, what you've accomplished so much. You've traveled to all of these countries. You've written on such a diverse range of subjects. What's on your bucket list, both personally and in terms of the topics you might like to cover, or have you yet to discover them?
Yeah. I mean, I think as we raise our children, I want them to really encounter the world. And I'm sure you know about this. Your folks were in the Peace Corps, I understand. So we want them to encounter the world. So I think we're going to, at some point, take them out of school and sort of do a year of study and travel in each continent.
Wow.
Including North America, of course, Asia, Africa, Maybe we'll skip Australia. I don't know. It's an amazing place. Is that a continent? Maybe it's not even a continent. I don't know. But anyway,
I think it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we're hoping to be in the non-English speaking part of the world, basically. I mean, my dad grew up in France. We lived there when I was a kid. It was an amazing experience. So, I think that's one thing. I don't know if it's a bucket list, but it's a plan anyway. And I think I'm going to write about what happened to me when I almost died. I'm an atheist. I'm not religious. As I was dying, a black hole opened up underneath me and I started getting pulled down into it. And then my dead father appeared. He was a physicist, a very rational man. My dead father appeared over me and started trying to comfort me. And I'm really at pains to explain how that happened. And I would like to I'm going to write a book called Pulse about what keeps us alive and what happens. Pulse. What keeps us alive and what happens when we die.
Well, in your research, I'll volunteer the services of my father. He's a cardiologist. He's seen many patients have near-death experiences, and I would be also interested to hear what he'd have to say about your case. We're very happy that it turned out the way it did. Any other points that I might have missed or that you wanted to cover?
I guess I would just say that, just in keeping with the focus of your organization, which I think is a wonderful one, the eternal human struggle is to balance the entirely healthy and natural desires of the individual to enact their own policies, to pursue their own interests and be left alone. To balance that with the equally important and enormously gratifying experience of being part of a community and committed to its welfare and even prepared to sacrifice for it. And when a person and a society can achieve a sort of rough balance of those two imperatives, you get great satisfaction and great social health and individual health. I think that's the eternal human struggle, and I think books like Atlas Shrugged go to the heart of one very, very important component of that human puzzle that we all must solve.
Well, Atlas Shrugged is about freedom, but of course there is Galt's Gulch, without spoiling that novel either, which is a community, kind of a utopia that people who are creative and creators, but who don't want to be taken advantage of and who want to live life on their own terms with friends and colleagues of their choosing. So that's a wonderful book. This is a spectacular book, and it's a wonderful read. I also recommend folks that you get it on Audible, and we'll put that link in our in the chat. And Sebastian, thank you very much. If you come back out to California, I would love to see you here, and we are very, very grateful for your insights and for the time today.
Likewise, thank you. It was a thrilling conversation, very, very interesting, and made me think in all kinds of new ways. And I always appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
That was